The night was devoid of stars, a thick blanket of clouds smothering any hint of celestial light. A persistent drizzle fell from the heavens, each drop tapping a cold, impatient rhythm on the hood of Michael's raincoat. An investigative journalist with a taste for the macabre, he had spent years chasing urban legends and forgotten histories. Tonight, his quest led him to the outskirts of town, to a place the locals refused to speak of, the Textile of Lost Voices. As he approached the towering silhouette of the abandoned garment factory, a sense of foreboding washed over him. The building loomed like a colossal tombstone, its once bright facade now a tapestry of cracked paint and encroaching ivy. Broken windows stared down like empty eye sockets, and the rusted remains of the factory's name hung precariously above the entrance, swaying ever so slightly in the wind. Michael hesitated at the threshold, the massive iron gates twisted and gaping open as if torn apart by some unimaginable force. A sudden gust of wind whispered past him, carrying with it a faint scent, something metallic mixed with the mustiness of decay. It was then he heard it, the distant, unmistakable hum of sewing machines. He paused, straining his ears. The factory had been abandoned for over 50 years and had no power supply. Yet, the rhythmic clatter persisted, a haunting mechanical heartbeat emanating from deep within the shadows. Steeling himself, he stepped inside. The world seemed to change the moment he crossed the threshold. The air grew thick, heavy with dust and something else, an oppressive weight that pressed against his chest. The beam of his flashlight pierced the darkness, revealing rows upon rows of antiquated sewing machines, their metal parts dulled by time. As he moved deeper, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was as if the machines were alive, operated by unseen hands. A sudden movement caught his eye, a spool of thread rolling across the floor, unraveling as it went. He followed it cautiously, each of his footsteps echoing ominously in the vast chamber. The spool came to an abrupt stop against a pair of worn leather shoes. Michael's gaze traveled upward, but there was no one there. Just empty air where a person should have been. His pulse quickened. The whispered voices began softly at first, a murmur just beyond comprehension. They seemed to surround him, overlapping and intertwining like a discordant melody. Words in an old dialect, perhaps, or maybe just the wind playing tricks. But then they grew louder, more urgent. He could make out fragments. Finish the work. We're still here. Join us. His flashlight flickered, the light waning as the darkness pressed in. Panic gnawed at the edges of his mind, but curiosity, or was it fate, propelled him forward. He entered what must have been the main workshop. The sight that greeted him froze him in place. Dozens of apparitions flickered in and out of existence, translucent figures of women hunched over their machines. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, expressions etched with sorrow and fatigue. The sound of scissors slicing through fabric cut sharply through the cacophony of machines and whispers. One of the spirits lifted her head and looked directly at him, her eyes meeting his with a pleading intensity. Before he could react, a deafening crash resounded behind him. He spun around to see that the entrance had somehow sealed itself, massive beams collapsing to block his exit. The walls seemed to close in, the room spinning as the spectral figures rose from their stations, turning their empty gazes upon him. A child's laughter echoed through the factory, eerily out of place. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he felt a cold, tiny hand slip into his. He looked down to see a little girl, her face smudged with soot, gazing up at him with mournful eyes. "Will you help us?" she whispered. "If the shadows of this forsaken place have captured your imagination, and you yearn to follow Michael deeper into this spine-chilling enigma, please like the video and subscribe to Haunted Grounds. Don't forget to ring the notification bell, so you won't miss a single heartbeat of our terrifying tales." Michael's hand trembled as the ghostly child's icy grip slipped away, her figure dissolving into the shadows. He stood frozen, the whispers still surrounding him, growing louder and more frantic. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he had just experienced. Was it his imagination? The factory's eerie atmosphere playing tricks on him? Or had he truly crossed the line into the supernatural? As his heartbeat thundered in his ears, something caught his attention, a faint glimmer on one of the workstations. Approaching cautiously, he saw it was a weathered photograph, its edges charred as though it had survived a fire. The image depicted a group of women, their expressions somber, standing before the factory's grand entrance. They were dressed in old-fashioned uniforms, their hands clutching sewing tools. Among them was a little girl, the same one who had just vanished before his eyes. Her wide eyes seemed to pierce through the photograph, staring directly at him. Beneath the photo was a name scrawled hastily, Lila. Something about that name pulled at Michael's memory, a nagging familiarity he couldn't quite place. He reached out to pick up the photograph, but as his fingers grazed its surface, the whispers shifted into sharp, agonized cries. He stumbled back, dropping the photo as the air grew colder, and the room seemed to darken. The cries subsided, replaced by the rhythmic sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. Turning his flashlight toward the noise, Michael followed the sound down a corridor lined with broken windows. The faint scent of smoke lingered here, mingling with the factory's oppressive mildew. His foot hit something solid, and he looked down to see a sewing kit, a rusted pair of scissors, and a spool of crimson thread. The thread seemed unnaturally vibrant, as if freshly dyed. He bent down to examine it, only to notice something carved into the handle of the scissors, MT. The initials sent a chill down his spine. They were the same as his own. His thoughts swirled in confusion until a memory surfaced, vague and fragmented, like a dream slipping through his fingers. His grandmother had once told him stories about the factory, tales of a fire that claimed the lives of dozens of workers. She had mentioned a girl named Lila, her voice trembling as she spoke of her laughter echoing through the halls long after her death. Michael suddenly remembered visiting his grandmother's attic as a child. There, he had found an old sewing machine, its mechanisms rusted but still intact. Attached to it had been a spool of thread, the same vivid red he now held in his hand. His grandmother had pulled him away, her face pale, muttering, "That thread binds more than fabric. It binds souls." The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. He wasn't here by coincidence. He was connected to this place, to its horrors, through his family's forgotten past. The factory's story wasn't just another investigation, it was his own history. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly as he pressed forward, the walls narrowing, the air thickening. He reached a set of double doors, slightly ajar, revealing what appeared to be the foreman's office. Inside, the room was untouched by time, as if frozen in the moment of the tragedy. A desk covered in soot bore an open ledger, its pages filled with names. Some had been crossed out, while others were circled in red ink. Scanning the ledger, Michael's breath caught in his throat as he found his grandmother's name, Margaret Taylor. Next to it, circled in red, was a single word, survivor. Beneath her name was a note, written in a hurried scrawl. "The price of survival is eternal debt. The bloodline will pay." The whispers swelled again, forming coherent words this time, a chorus of anguished voices. "She escaped, but we remained. The debt is yours now." The office door slammed shut behind him, and Michael's flashlight flickered violently. In the brief flashes of light, he saw them, the workers from the photograph. Their hollow eyes stared at him, their hands outstretched, sewing needles glinting like daggers. He backed away, his mind a storm of terror and confusion. Then he heard her voice again, the little girl, Lila, soft and mournful. "You have to finish what she started, or you'll never leave." The walls seemed to close in, the cries of the dead growing deafening. Michael felt trapped, the weight of his grandmother's sins and the factory's curse pressing down on him. He realized he was no longer just an observer. The past wasn't forgotten, it was waiting for him to confront it. What secrets still linger in the depths of the Textile of Lost Voices? And how far will Michael have to go to uncover the truth? The whispers grew louder, wrapping around Michael like invisible chains. His pulse raced as the dim light from his flickering flashlight revealed a long-forgotten storage room. Shelves crumbled under the weight of dust-covered bolts of fabric, their once vivid patterns now faded and lifeless. In the center of the room stood a mannequin, its headless frame draped in a tattered dress stitched together with mismatched patches of fabric. But it wasn't the mannequin that froze Michael in place, it was the mirror behind it. Unlike everything else in the factory, the mirror was pristine, its surface unervingly clear. Michael stepped closer, drawn by an almost magnetic force. His reflection stared back at him, but something wasn't right. His reflection's eyes glowed faintly, and its expression shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakably different. The figure in the mirror smiled, a cold, sinister grin that sent a shiver through his spine. A voice emanated from the reflection, deeper and more resonant than the whispers around him. "You've come to pay the debt," it said. "But payment requires sacrifice." Michael stumbled backward, his flashlight dropping to the ground and casting long, erratic shadows across the room. The reflection didn't mimic his movements. Instead, it stepped forward, its hand pressing against the inside of the mirror's surface. Michael's breath hitched as the glass rippled like water, and the figure's voice continued. "Choose, Michael. Sacrifice something precious, or be consumed by the curse of this place. Suddenly, the air thickened, and the temperature plummeted. The whispers coalesced into voices, each more desperate and mournful than the last. Shadows moved around him, taking the vague forms of the factory's workers. One of them, a woman with hollow, sunken eyes, stepped closer and extended a hand. In her palm was the red thread he had found earlier, now glowing faintly. Michael hesitated. The room felt alive, watching, waiting. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The woman's voice was barely more than a breath. "Finish the work. Bind the thread. Sacrifice what you hold dear." The mirror rippled again, and an image formed on its surface, a memory from his childhood. He saw himself as a boy, sitting beside his grandmother as she sewed. Her hands worked deftly, and her voice hummed a soft tune. She had always told him stories, but one stood out, the tale of a cursed thread that could stitch souls together. "To use it," she had said, "is to pay a price that never ends." Michael's gaze shifted to the glowing thread in the woman's hand, then back to the mirror. The figure within it now held something new, a photograph of his grandmother, young and vibrant, smiling as she stood in front of the factory. Beneath the photograph was a single word, burned into the image: debt. The reflection spoke again, its tone mocking. "Will you give her memory away? Or will you bind your soul to ours? Choose wisely, for either way, the work must continue." Michael's mind spiraled. He understood now. The curse had latched onto his family, binding them to the factory's horrors. His grandmother had escaped, but her freedom had come at a cost now demanded of him. He clenched his fists, the weight of the decision crushing him. The voices grew louder, the shadows pressing closer, their outlines becoming sharper and more human-like. The mirror showed another image. Himself, trapped within the factory, working endlessly at a sewing machine, his hands bleeding as the thread stitched itself into his skin. A scream tore through the room, and Michael realized it came from his own throat. He had to make a choice. He could let go of the photograph, sacrificing the last tangible connection to his grandmother, or take the thread and bind his soul to the factory, becoming a part of its eternal torment. Tears streamed down his face as he reached out. The glowing thread pulsed in the woman's hand, and the mirror's surface rippled violently. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision. What will Michael choose? Will he sacrifice the memory of his loved one, or condemn himself to the factory's curse? Michael's hand hovered over the glowing thread as the whispers grew into a deafening cacophony. The air in the room turned frigid, his breath visible in the faint, flickering light. He gripped his flashlight tightly, scanning the room as the shadows writhed unnaturally, like living entities slithering along the walls and ceiling. The reflection in the mirror had vanished, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight pressing on his chest. He stumbled backward, desperate to escape the oppressive silence that followed. Then, faint and distant, a whisper emerged, soft and melodic, cutting through the stillness. "Michael." The sound was delicate, almost soothing, but laced with an undertone that made his stomach churn. It was a voice he knew, his grandmother's voice. The whisper repeated his name, this time closer. The sound seemed to come from every corner of the room, echoing off the crumbling walls. "Michael, help them, don't let it consume you." He spun around, searching for the source, but found only the suffocating darkness. The whispers transformed, their melody unraveling into fragmented sentences, each voice layered atop the next. "She knew, she ran. We burned. Threads bind, scissors cut. No escape. The dead is eternal." The shadows began to stretch and twist, taking on vague human shapes. Figures emerged, workers with gaunt, skeletal faces, their empty eye sockets staring blankly ahead. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking as though manipulated by invisible strings. One of them stepped closer, her head tilting unnaturally as she spoke, her voice rasping. "Finish the work, or join us." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He staggered away, tripping over debris and falling to the ground. His flashlight rolled out of his grasp, casting wild beams of light that only seemed to animate the figures further. As he scrambled to his feet, he noticed something horrifying. The shadows were no longer confined to the walls. They were creeping toward him, pooling like liquid darkness, their edges curling and reaching for his legs. The melodic whisper returned, louder now. It was no longer just his grandmother's voice. It had become a chorus, a symphony of despair and longing. "Take the thread, Michael, weave the debt. Free us." The room began to transform. The walls pulsed as though alive, the peeling paint shifting to reveal images of fire, screams frozen in time, and charred bodies clutching fabric. The sewing machines in the corner of the room roared to life, their rhythmic clattering filling the air. The sound was almost hypnotic, pulling at his mind, demanding his attention. He turned toward the mirror again, now glowing faintly. In its depths he saw his grandmother, not as he remembered her, but younger, her face pale and streaked with soot. She sat at a sewing machine, tears streaming down her cheeks as her hands moved mechanically, threading the cursed fabric. Behind her loomed a massive shadow, an amorphous figure with countless hands, each gripping a tool, scissors, needles, spools of thread. The shadow's voice boomed, shaking the walls. "Finish what she began, Michael. Bind the thread. Seal the pact." Michael fell to his knees, his mind a storm of terror and confusion. He felt the thread in his hand pulsate like a heartbeat, warm and alive. The shadows closed in, brushing against his skin with icy fingers. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. As he sat there, frozen, a faint movement caught his eye. One of the spectral figures, the little girl, Lila, emerged from the darkness. Her ghostly form shimmered with faint light, and her expression was one of sorrow and resolve. She extended a hand toward him, her voice breaking through the chaos. "You can stop it, but only if you listen." The sewing machines roared louder, the mirror pulsed with unnatural light, and the shadows surged closer. Michael was trapped between the growing darkness, the weight of his family's sins, and the faint hope offered by the little girl. What secrets will Lila reveal? Can Michael trust her, or is she another pawn of the factory's malevolent force? Stay with us as the terror deepens. Like this video, subscribe to Haunted Grounds, and turn on notifications for the next chilling chapter in this nightmarish tale. Michael could feel the cold tendrils of darkness wrapping around his legs, dragging him closer to the heart of the factory's curse. The whispers had become screams, their anguish filling the air like a deafening storm. His breathing quickened as Lila's ghostly form stood before him, her outstretched hand trembling. "Listen to me," she pleaded, her voice a faint melody against the cacophony. "The thread binds more than fabric. It binds fear, memory, and life. If you take it, it will demand everything." Michael hesitated, the glowing thread pulsing in his hand like a living thing. The shadows recoiled momentarily, as if afraid of the light emanating from Lila's presence. He felt an odd sense of safety, but it was fleeting. The darkness surged again, and with it came visions that weren't his but felt deeply personal. The factory walls dissolved, replaced by a pristine home he didn't recognize. A younger version of his grandmother stood in the kitchen, humming a tune as she sewed a patch onto a child's torn shirt. The boy sitting beside her was Michael himself, no older than 7. The warmth of the scene made his chest ache, but as he blinked, the light faded. The kitchen darkened, the hum twisted into a shrill cry, and the thread in her hands turned crimson. The vision shattered, and Michael was thrust back into the factory. His legs buckled under the weight of what he had seen. The whispers clawed at his mind, filling it with doubts and fears. They spoke of guilt, of failure, of the inevitability of his doom. "You can't escape," the voices hissed. "You were destined to finish this work. She left it for you. The debt is in your blood." The factory shifted again, the shadows playing tricks on his eyes. He saw rows of workers, their hands bleeding as they stitched impossibly long pieces of fabric. Their faces were blank, their movements mechanical, and yet their eyes glimmered with fear. One of the figures turned to him, her face half melted from an unseen fire. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "You feel it, don't you? The thread pulling at your soul, weaving you into its story. It's too late to stop now." Michael's heart pounded, his skin slick with cold sweat. The factory wasn't just haunting him, it was feeding on his fear, amplifying it, twisting it. He realized that every step deeper into the factory wasn't just a journey into its horrors, it was a descent into his own mind. The thread wasn't simply a tool of the curse, it was a mirror, reflecting his deepest fears and weaknesses. The machinery roared to life again, and the sound seemed to echo within his skull. His vision blurred as more hallucinations struck. He saw himself standing at a sewing machine, the needle piercing his fingers as the fabric demanded blood. He saw his grandmother begging for forgiveness, her voice drowned out by the screams of the workers she had left behind. And then he saw the worst vision of all. A mirror appeared before him, and within it was his reflection. Only it wasn't his reflection at all. The figure stared back at him with hollow, glowing eyes, its hands clutching a needle and thread. The reflection smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was a grin of triumph, as if it knew something he didn't. "Fear is the thread," the reflection whispered, its voice a perfect imitation of his own. "And you are already sewn into the fabric." Michael screamed, stumbling backward, but the vision persisted. The factory seemed alive, pulsating with his terror, thriving on every ounce of dread coursing through his veins. He dropped the thread, but it didn't fall. It hovered in the air, glowing brighter with each beat of his heart. Lila's voice cut through the storm. "It wants you to give in. Fear feeds it. You must fight, or it will consume everything." But how could he fight something that had already wrapped itself so tightly around his mind and soul? As the shadows closed in, Michael was forced to confront a chilling truth. The factory didn't just trap its victims physically. It wove their fears into an endless tapestry, each thread a life consumed by its curse. Will Michael find the strength to resist, or will his fear become another strand in the factory's cursed design? Michael's pulse thundered in his ears as the factory seemed to inhale, the air growing impossibly still and heavy. The shadows, which moments ago had been creeping along the walls, now froze in place, their dark tendrils twitching in anticipation. The glowing thread hovered before him, pulsing in sync with his heartbeat. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was alive, demanding something he wasn't sure he could give. A sudden crash echoed through the factory, and the ground beneath him trembled. The machinery roared back to life, but this time the sound was different. The rhythmic clatter of sewing machines gave way to something more sinister, a guttural, grinding noise that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The mirror on the far side of the room shimmered, and his distorted reflection appeared once more. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind the reflection loomed the amorphous shadow from earlier, its countless hands clutching sewing tools that gleamed like weapons. The shadow moved closer to the glass, and Michael's reflection mimicked his terror-stricken expression. The shadow's voice boomed, low and guttural, shaking the factory's very foundation. "You've come this far, Michael," it said. "There's no turning back. The debt must be paid." The mirror's surface rippled, and Michael saw images flash before him, scenes of fire, anguish, and desperation. He saw the factory workers in their final moments, trapped as the flames consumed them. Their screams filled the air, and their terror became a palpable force that wrapped around his chest. Then the image shifted, and he saw his grandmother again. She was younger, her face pale with fear as she worked tirelessly at a sewing machine. Her hands moved with unnatural speed, blood dripping onto the fabric as the cursed thread stitched itself into intricate patterns. She looked up suddenly, her eyes locking with his, and her voice echoed through the room. "Michael, you can end this," she said, her tone pleading. "But the price is high. Are you willing to pay it?" The mirror shattered, and the shards flew outward, but instead of falling to the ground, they hovered midair, forming a jagged circle around the thread. The glowing strand brightened, and Michael felt a pull, an invisible force drawing him toward the center of the room. The voices of the workers rose in a mournful chorus, their spectral forms materializing around him. They chanted in a language he couldn't understand, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Lila appeared once more, her ghostly form flickering like a dying flame. "You're at the end now," she whispered. "To break the curse, you must offer something that cannot be undone. Something precious. Only then will the debt be settled." Michael's mind raced. What could he possibly give? His gaze fell on the thread, and he remembered the reflection's words. Fear is the thread. He realized the factory thrived on the terror it instilled in its victims, feeding on their deepest anxieties. But then he noticed something else. The thread didn't just pulse in time with his heartbeat. It reacted to his thoughts, glowing brighter whenever his fear spiked. It wasn't just a tool of the factory, it was its anchor. The shadow loomed closer, its many hands stretching toward him. "You cannot resist," it growled. "Fear binds you. You are ours now." Michael clenched his fists, his body trembling. He knew he had to make a choice. He could surrender, give in to the overwhelming dread that threatened to consume him, or he could fight, sacrificing the one thing the factory craved most, his fear. Summoning every ounce of courage, Michael stepped forward and grabbed the thread with both hands. The moment his skin touched it, pain shot through him, searing his mind and body. The shadows screamed, recoiling as the light from the thread intensified. "I'm not afraid of you," Michael shouted, his voice echoing through the factory. The thread burned brighter, and the spectral workers began to dissolve, their mournful cries fading into the distance. The shadow bellowed in rage, its massive form writhing as it was dragged toward the glowing thread. But the battle wasn't over. The shadow lashed out, its dark tendrils wrapping around Michael, trying to pull him into its depths. He felt the cold grip of despair creeping into his mind, whispering doubts and fears. Give in, the shadow hissed. You cannot win. You are already mine. Michael gritted his teeth, holding the thread tighter. He thought of his grandmother, of the story she had told him, and of the workers who had suffered for so long. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for them. With a final surge of willpower, he pulled the thread taut, snapping it in two. A blinding light erupted from the break, consuming the shadow and filling the factory with warmth. The machinery fell silent, the whispers ceased, and the air grew still. As the light faded, Michael collapsed to the ground, his body shaking from the effort. The factory was silent now, the shadows gone, and the cursed thread lay in two lifeless pieces at his feet. But even as he caught his breath, a lingering unease settled over him. The factory might have been silenced, but the cost of his choice would follow him forever. The factory fell deathly silent after the blinding light faded, but Michael's victory felt hollow. The oppressive air lingered, heavy with the scent of burnt fabric and ash. His body trembled, and his hands, now blistered from gripping the cursed thread, refused to unclench. He had snapped the thread and silenced the shadow, but something told him it wasn't over. From the depths of the factory, a low rumble began to rise, reverberating through the floor like the growl of a waking beast. The walls trembled, and the faint hum of machinery returned, not the cacophony of the past, but a rhythmic, sinister pulse, as if the factory itself was alive and gathering strength for one final act. Michael staggered to his feet, his breath shallow and ragged. He turned to the spectral workers who still lingered, their translucent forms flickering like dying candles. Their faces, once etched with sorrow, now showed faint traces of relief. Yet they didn't fade away. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Lila appeared once more, her form more solid now, her eyes full of both gratitude and sorrow. "You broke the thread," she said softly, "but the factory won't let go so easily. Its heart remains." Michael's heart sank. "The heart? What do you mean?" Lila pointed toward the farthest corner of the factory, where a staircase spiraled downward into the earth. A faint red glow emanated from the darkness below, pulsing in time with the hum. "It's where it all began," Lila whispered. "Where the pact was made. You've silenced the shadow, but the curse still lives in the heart of the factory. If you don't destroy it, this will never end." Michael's legs felt like lead, his every instinct screaming at him to leave, to run as far from this cursed place as possible. But the look in Lila's eyes stopped him. She wasn't pleading for herself, she was pleading for the others, the workers, the souls bound to the factory for decades. Summoning every ounce of courage, he descended the staircase. Each step creaked beneath his weight, and the air grew hotter, thicker, as if the factory itself were breathing down his neck. The red glow intensified, illuminating the walls with an eerie, shifting light. Strange symbols etched into the stone seemed to writhe and pulse, alive with malevolent energy. At the bottom of the stairs, he entered a cavernous chamber unlike anything he had seen above. The heart of the factory was a monstrous amalgamation of machinery and organic matter, pulsating as if alive. Pipes snaked out from its core, dripping a thick, black substance that hissed as it hit the ground. At the center of the chamber stood the shadow, its form smaller now, weakened but still formidable. It turned toward Michael, its hollow, glowing eyes burning with rage. "You dare defy me?" it roared, its voice shaking the chamber. "You think breaking a thread can sever centuries of power?" Michael clenched his fists, stepping forward despite the tremors that racked his body. "This ends now," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The shadow laughed, a sound that sent icy fingers crawling down his spine. "You've already lost," it hissed. "You're part of this place now. You've touched the thread. You've seen its truth. Even if you destroy me, you will never escape." The pipes around the chamber groaned, and tendrils of black liquid shot toward him, twisting through the air like snakes. Michael dove to the side, narrowly avoiding their grasp. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could help him. Then he saw it. Embedded in the heart of the machinery was a massive spindle, the source of the red glow. The thread wound tightly around it seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the factory, feeding its unnatural life. "That's it," Lila's voice whispered in his mind. "The spindle. Destroy it, and the curse will die with it." Michael's eyes locked onto the spindle as the shadow loomed closer, its tendrils lashing out. He grabbed a piece of broken machinery, a jagged metal rod, and charged toward the glowing core. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with the stench of sulfur and decay. The shadow screamed, its voice shaking the chamber. "You fool! You'll doom yourself with us." Michael didn't stop. He plunged the rod into the spindle, the metal cutting through the glowing thread. The chamber erupted in chaos. The heart of the factory convulsed, the machinery grinding to a halt as the red glow flickered and dimmed. The shadow shrieked, its form collapsing in on itself, dragged toward the dying core. Its final words echoed through the chamber. "This isn't over. The dead always returns." Michael barely had time to dive away as the spindle exploded, sending shards of metal and glowing thread flying. The cavern shook violently, and cracks spread along the walls and ceiling. He stumbled up the staircase, his body screaming in protest as the factory began to collapse. The spectral workers stood silently as he passed, their faces serene. Lila appeared one last time, her form glowing softly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of countless souls finally freed. But beware, curses like this never truly die. As Michael reached the surface, the factory crumbled behind him, collapsing into itself with a deafening roar. The glowing thread burned away into nothingness, and for the first time, silence enveloped the sight. But as Michael stood in the pre-dawn light, catching his breath, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. In his pocket, he found a small fragment of the thread, still glowing faintly. The curse might have been silenced, but its remnants clung to him. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the ruins of the factory in pale light. Michael stood at a distance, watching as the last of the cursed structure crumbled into a heap of smoldering rubble. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive aura that had suffocated him for hours seemed to dissipate. Yet, a deep unease rooted itself in his chest. The fragment of glowing thread in his pocket was a quiet reminder that the nightmare wasn't entirely over. As he walked away, the echoes of the factory lingered in his mind. The whispers, the shadows, the chilling vision of his grandmother trapped in its curse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the thread, its faint crimson glow pulsing softly, like the last ember of a dying fire. Why had it remained? Was it a souvenir of his survival, or a seed of the terror waiting to bloom again? He shoved the thread back into his pocket and started his car, desperate to leave the site behind. The engine sputtered to life, but as he drove, the road seemed unnaturally long, stretching endlessly through the misty countryside. The sun climbed higher, yet the light failed to pierce the dense fog that clung to the earth. Michael's unease deepened when his phone buzzed, an alert from his audio recorder, still running in his bag. He pulled over and retrieved the device, curiosity battling his dread. The recorder displayed several new files, despite the fact that he hadn't touched it since entering the factory. His fingers trembled as he pressed play. At first, the recording was static, faint and uneven, but then the voices began. "Michael," the whisper was unmistakable, sending a chill down his spine. It wasn't Lila's voice, nor the shadows. It was his grandmother's, soft and sorrowful. "You freed them," she said, her tone wavering. "But the thread binds more than you know. It's not finished." Michael froze. He stared at the recorder as more voices joined hers, overlapping in a haunting chorus. Some were angry, others pleading, and a few simply repeated his name, their desperation clawing at his mind. "You carry it now," one voice rasped. "The curse doesn't die. It changes," another added. He turned the recorder off, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The fog outside his car thickened, and the landscape seemed unfamiliar. The road, once lined with trees and rolling hills, now stretched into an expanse of barren ground. The sky darkened, despite it being midday, and the faint outline of the ruined factory appeared in his rearview mirror, impossibly close, as if he had never left. Michael stepped out of the car, panic taking hold. He scanned the horizon, but the factory stood in the distance, its jagged silhouette intact. The rubble he had left behind was gone. The faint hum of machinery reached his ears, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of sewing machines. The thread in his pocket grew warm, its glow intensifying. He pulled it out, only to find that it had grown longer, winding around his fingers like a living thing. He tried to throw it away, but it clung to his hand, tightening its grip. "You cannot escape," the whispers said, rising in unison. "The work continues." The factory loomed closer with each passing second, though Michael hadn't moved. He tried to get back into the car, but it wouldn't start. The air grew thick again, heavy with the familiar scent of smoke and decay. He screamed, a primal sound of terror and frustration, but it was swallowed by the growing hum of the factory. Then in the distance he saw her, Lila, standing at the edge of the road. Her ghostly form was brighter now, almost tangible. She raised her hand, beckoning him toward her. "You have to finish it," she said, her voice clear but solemn. "The curse has changed, but you can still choose. End it here, or it will follow you forever. Michael's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move, each step toward Lila an act of sheer will. As he approached her, the factory's hum grew deafening, the ground beneath him trembling as the shadows began to rise once more. "What do I have to do?" he shouted, his voice breaking. Lila's face twisted in sorrow. "You have to carry it back to where it began," she said. "To the spindle. Only then will it truly end." "But the price," her voice faltered and her form flickered. "The price is everything." Michael turned to see the factory towering behind him, its windows glowing with an unholy light. The thread in his hand coiled tighter, pulling him toward the building as if it were alive. He glanced back at Lila, but she was gone. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices laced with anger and desperation. "You are the thread, Michael. You are the spindle. The work will never stop." As he crossed the factory's threshold once more, the doors slammed shut behind him. The light in the windows dimmed, and the whispers fell silent. The mystery of the Textile of Lost Voices would remain unsolved to those on the outside, but Michael's journey had just begun. If you're as haunted by Michael's fate as he is by the factory's curse, like this video, subscribe to Haunted Grounds, and share your thoughts below. The nightmare may be over for some, but the threads of terror are far from finished.